Completing individual and summary review forms. AmeriCorps Evidence-Based Reviews, Section D, Evidence Tier. Section D of the individual and summary review forms focus on the evidence tier of supporting studies submitted with AmeriCorps state and national grant applications. The section is comprised of only 6 fillable fields through drop-downs, boxes, and text fields. To complete field D1, simply select the number of studies submitted by the applicant from the drop-down menu. Even if the number of studies submitted as attachments to the application exceeds the number allowed, enter this absolute number. Field D1B references the number of studies reviewed. From the drop-down menu, select the number of studies that were reviewed by the panel. A maximum of 2 or 3 studies can be reviewed. All applicants may submit up to 2 evaluation reports if they wish to be considered for the preliminary, moderate, or strong evidence tier. And if a grantee was required to submit an evaluation to meet AmeriCorps evaluation requirements, a total of 3 reports may be considered. If a grantee is required to submit an evaluation report, this will be noted by the entry Yes in field C1. If more than the allowable number of studies are submitted, the lead reviewer shall identify which reports the panel should consider. Highest priority will go to the required evaluation report. The most recent date of completion should be prioritized. Additional studies should never be reviewed. Field D2 asks for the number of studies contributing to the evidence tier. This must be less than or equal to the number of studies listed in field D1. Studies not considered include those that are not of the same intervention as described in the application. Studies that are not outcome or impact evaluations, and studies that do not meaningfully contribute to the selected assessment evidence tier. As an example, an applicant may submit both a high-quality QED evaluation and a non-experimental outcome evaluation and be assessed as being in the moderate evidence tier. The figure selected in figure D2 should be 1, as only the quasi-experimental study is suitable for the moderate evidence tier. In contrast, if the applicant submitted 2 QED evaluations that jointly contributed to the assessment of the moderate evidence, the figure selected in D2 would be 2. When determining whether a submitted companion study is of the same intervention as described in the proposal, you should consider characteristics of the beneficiary population, characteristics of the population delivering the intervention, the dosage as defined by frequency and duration, and the design of the intervention. This includes key components and activities, the setting in which the intervention is delivered, and finally, the outcomes of the intervention. These areas should be clearly outlined in the proposal program design and logic model. Submitted reports that do not match the intervention proposed in the application should not be considered to be applicable and do not contribute to the overall evaluation. In field D3, you are asked to select the evidence tier assessed from the drop-down menu. Using the 2021 evidence tier checklist as a guide, you should select pre-preliminary, preliminary, moderate, or strong from the drop-down menu. If the submitted studies do not meet the requirements of a particular tier as laid out in the evidence tier checklist, you should consider the applicant for the next lowest evidence tier instead. For example, if an applicant submits a report that they self-identify as a QED, but does not adequately determine baseline equivalence of the treatment and comparison groups, you may determine that the report meets the requirements for a non-experimental outcome study that would place the applicant in the preliminary evidence tier. In that case, you should assess the evidence quality standards based on the requirements and criteria for the preliminary evidence tier, and the number of reports entered in D2 should be 1. If the study is determined to be inadequate, even to meet the definition of an outcome study, the applicant should be placed in the pre-preliminary evidence tier, and the number of reports entered in D2 would be 0. In that case, the information provided in the application narrative, such as a description of performance measurement data and other studies, should be used to assess the evidence quality standards. In field D4, we're asked to provide a justification narrative for the evidence tier rating selected in D3. These descriptions should be written so that AmeriCorps staff and staff of the program who are not evaluation experts can understand how the evidence was assessed. These justifications, like all information in the individual review form, may be shared with the applicant after funding decisions are made. The justification should include a statement of the identified evidence tier, AmeriCorps requirements for obtaining that evidence tier, an explanation of how the applicant's evidence aligns with the assigned evidence tier, AmeriCorps' defined requirements, and how the applicant's evidence meets those defined requirements. This might include the types of studies submitted and the relevance of those studies to the proposed program. And finally, you should mention if any studies were not considered. Your justification should not include recommendations for improvement, comments about the overall application, descriptions about future evaluations that might be planned. For these assessments, we're exclusively focused on studies that have already been conducted. The final field in section D is D5. In this dialog box, simply enter the identifying information for the most powerful study submitted. Include the report title, the author's name, and report year. Here is section D completed for our Washington Reading Corps example.